Ladies and gentlemen, in this Red Gaming Tech.com video, we have a slew of information regarding the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4's development. Now, this specifically does mostly and primarily focus on indie development, but it will focus somewhat on AAA titles as well. Now, just yesterday, we learned that Microsoft will be opening the gates somewhat towards indie self-publishing on the Xbox One. We also learned a pretty important piece of information regarding the Xbox One. That is, if you were to go into any retail store, you were to buy an Xbox One system, you were to take it home with you, and then, say, 6 months down the line, you were to say, you know what, I actually fancy trying my hand at indie development, then fine, that retail console will function as a development kit, which is very, very good news indeed. This is contrary to the PlayStation 4 development kits. The PS4 development kits, I'm sure you guys have probably seen leaked pictures around the internet or maybe even the FCC filings. Those suckers are expensive. They cost about $2,500 US, so I'm going to use dollar prices for this. And that means that there's about a $2,000 discrepancy between the Xbox One development kit, since it's just a retail console, and the PS4 development kit. However, as per normal, if that's all that there was to the story, it wouldn't be that particularly interesting. However, there is a lot more besides. Firstly, the development kits are supposedly, from what we actually understand, and I quote, being given out like candy from Sony. And by which I mean that they are being given to indie developers for completely and utterly the price of air. In other words, zero, nothing, nada. They're getting them for free. Now, some sources have stated that this is for about 1 year. They'll basically loan you the system for 1 year, and they'll say, okay, well, you've got 1 year to play around with it. No cost to you, good sir. Try out, see what you can do with the games, and then go from there. So obviously, in about a year's time, if you can put together a game, sell it, then, well, after that, they can, see what happens. And which, it makes sense if you think about it. In about a year's time, you should know whether you're going to have a viable product. And for most indie games, especially if they're ports from, say, the PC, if you think about it, about a year is enough time. After all, quite a lot of AAA titles, maybe not quite AAA, but a lot of really big titles are being ported to the PS4 in very short amount of times. And even a couple of AAA titles we know have been ported in not too long at all, 2-3 months' time, which is pretty damn fantastic. So what about Microsoft? Does that mean that, well, everyone's going to have a indie development kit and that's the end of it? Well, this is where, once again, rumour and supposition comes to mind. Sources are named sources because, let's face it, if it was Tom in, let's say, the IT department or Tom in R&D happened to say this, obviously he would get some backlash because a lot of this stuff is under confidentiality agreements, hence the reason that it's always unnamed sources, because they don't want to risk their getting either sued or their jobs, which, to be fair, I don't blame him or her. Regardless, a source has said that it actually costs a few $100 to develop for the system. It's basically a licensing fee or a kit. It's not been 100% confirmed because, obviously, once again, unnamed sources and all. But as far as what we understand it, it is a fee attached to this, unlike Sony. So I suppose it depends on your perspective. I suppose it is, if you're completely new to development and you just want to try it out, it'll cost you a couple $100, whereas on the other hand, you may have to actually convince Sony that you're a reputable company. So I guess it's kind of swings and roundabouts in that case. So what does the PS4 development kit get you? Well, we do know that it gets you quite a bit. It has a lot of different functionality and will basically have a debug functionality, extra ports to be able to, say, stream data from hard drives or from networks, and a lot more besides. Now, on the PS3, their development kits cost between $1,000 to $10,000. So you can imagine that the $2,500 price point is pretty damn popular with developers right now. It's also not particularly a mystery that Sony themselves are extremely advocating indie development. They're basically best buddies right now with indie development. To be fair, and a slight aside, a couple of indies have actually said that people aren't giving Nintendo enough credit. Nintendo, are being very quiet in the background, but they are working very well with indies, but that's a slight aside. However, I'm going to read you guys out a quote. By and large, indie development has become extremely accessible, especially on our platform. This is from Sony, of course. We offer a lot of freedom and flexibility, and we've built the PS Store promotions around indie titles and their launch dates. Also, we provide indies with additional support, like putting them on stage at E3, hosting indie-focused events like the Indie Arcade at GDC. Most importantly, our developer relation teams have really developed relationship with devs, and they've talked to daily, offer advice, and really advocate for them and their particular needs. So let's talk a little bit more about the Xbox. There have been a series of tweets blasting towards Phil Spencer, and these have talked about things such as available resources for indie developers. They've spoken about how easy it is to promote a game if you are an indie developer. In other words, what tools and marketing will Microsoft give you to make your game stand out from the crowd? The first question was, and I quote, "So do indie developers get access to a bigger pool of RAM, or are we limited to 3 GB in the Windows partition?" Phil responded, "Goal is to allow devs access to full pool of resources available, no indie RAM limit," which is pretty damn good, really. I mean, yesterday there was some questions raised to this because some developers have already started to raise questions and said, well, it seems like there's going to be some limits imposed on the Xbox One. I'm not really sure where I stand on this because we've heard 2 conflicting reports. Now, if Phil is telling the truth, then great. However, the goal is not saying that is actually what the case is right now. So I guess we're just going to have to wait and see. I'm really hoping that it is the case that indie developers will have access to all of the GPU power that, say, a AAA developer such as, say, Capcom would have access to. So now these 2 questions are probably even slightly more important. The first question was on how developers, or should I say, you as a customer would be able to find these titles. And it was kind of like this. So now Xbox Live becomes a junkyard, and you're fine with that. Someone else replies, how will indie games gain more promotion in the marketplace for X1 exactly? Now, he's responded, Phil, with, in the first question, we are committed to creating search tools and a marketplace pivots to allow you to find games you'll like. The second one, more details to come. Likely pivot is most popular, giving you a view of what people are buying regardless of how they're published. Okay, obviously right now they are still figuring this stuff out. That's extremely important, but this pales, in my personal opinion, to what Sony are doing. They are actually giving you a dedicated channel. Now here's the problem with the most popular. If you are, and I'm just going to use Minecraft because it's a ridiculously popular game among indie developers and people who buy games regardless. If you put Minecraft on there, it is going to become on the most popular. If you put a game, however, that people don't really know about, but it's a really good game, it's a hidden gem, but people just don't know about it that well right now, because let's say it's not been released on PC yet, or it's getting a simultaneous release on PC, Xbox, PS4, whatever scenario you want to give this. How the balls are people going to find it? It's not going to become under the most popular, because people actually have to know about a title. People have to actually buy a title for it to become popular. The same thing for a search tool. One cannot search for something if one does not know about something. It's actually a very, very, very important part of marketing, actually, that how can you tell someone about a service if they are not searching for a service or a product that you have? It's one of the reasons that, for example, YouTube advertising exists, or television advertising exists, or print media advertising exists, or whatever. Even things such as these videos that we're putting out on RGT. It's not exactly advertising, but in a way it's actually acting as informing you guys of a service or a game or a product or a whatever that is being released or does already exist, so you guys can know about it. But if you don't know about a title, because it's impossible to know about every single game out there. There's probably dozens of different movies and TV shows and games and books and bands and goodness knows what else that you would actually probably really like if you heard them. But unless you do hear them initially and someone tells you the name, or maybe you'll even just see a small snippet of gameplay, for example. That's one of the reasons that we put the title of the game right there on the top when we first launched the video. It's because sometimes we get people asking, because we didn't do this initially, we'll hold our hands up, and it was a massive oversight on our own part. And people said, well, what game was that? And we had to keep individually replying, and it's a bit of a stupid thing. So we just said, you know what, it's better, more professional if we put the game there. It's just access-free advertising to the games companies, and that's very fair in my opinion. If you like the look of something, you'll want to play it. So the problem I've got with this is, look, the search tools and most popular, they're not something that, in my opinion, is particularly impressive. I mean, search tools that already exist in the marketplaces, and I'll completely admit that Sony's are not exactly perfect. But I think the indie channel, and I believe Nintendo are going to act and do similar as well, because, they realize that, look, you can't compete, especially Microsoft, since they're actually encouraging downloads of huge AAA games. I mean, let's face it, do they really expect, a game like Limbo, for example, which was a really good game, incidentally, and would actually encourage you guys to check it out. It's a really, really abstract game, but it's a very cool game. Do they really expect a game like Limbo to be in most popular if titles like, say, Call of Duty and Mass Effect 4 just happened to be released within the last couple of months? No, because of course, them and their DLC are of course going to fill up those slots. So once again, I think it's a case of, look, they need to do more. Now, obviously, to be fair to Microsoft, they still are making these policies. And this is a very, very important part of this, because Microsoft is starting to do quite a lot of a U-turn right now in terms of how they are actually dealing with indie developers, because I think they're starting to realize that indie developers are not just important in terms of sales. In other words, that obviously they get a percentage of the revenue, as does Sony, as does Nintendo, as does Steam. It's fine. After all, they're not just going to give away these games, to somewhat advertise the games, and I use that in quotation marks, and to provide the bandwidth and whatever else to actually distribute the titles as well as the patches and whatever else they need to do. They're not just going to do that out of the goodness of their heart, because that just doesn't make sense and isn't realistic. That's not how business works. However, they started to realise that it's not just a source of revenue, it's also a good plug for AAA games in between releases, because after all, a AAA game is not released every 1 to 2 weeks, and even if it was released every, say, 2 weeks, even if sometimes you do get a glut, for example, of AAA games over a month to 2 month period, and other times you'll have a massive dry month, but even if it was, it doesn't necessarily mean that you will be interested. For example, you may hate FPS, and you may hate, let's say, racing games. So let's say 1 month Forza was released, and say 2 weeks later, let's say Call of Duty was released. I'm just using these as pure examples. You may not be interested in those particular games. You might have an interest in RPGs, you might have an interest in fighting games, you might have an interest in, turn-based games, or whatever you're interested in. Then those are the games that you will be focused upon. So, in other words, right then and there, you're not buying anything. So, in other words, Microsoft right then and there aren't making any profit from you. So, at least the AAAs at least the indie games are going to be there to somewhat fill the gap. In addition to all of this, and another point that I'd like to make is, I think it's actually quite interesting to see the fact that indies, in my opinion anyway, are being used as somewhat of a chess piece for developers. Now, I'm not saying this in a negative, derogatory way at all. I think Sony have had a history for a while now of actually supporting indie developers because, well, they realized the travesty that was the PS3 development. Now, once again, I'm not insulting the PS3 development, I'm not insulting the PlayStation 3, I'm not insulting Sony. It's a mere fact that the PS3 was an absolute bastard to program for. It was not your friend. It was not like, I don't know, programming in Python or something. It was obscure a lot of the time because a lot of the functionalities were hidden behind hidden behind the SPUs of the cell processor. And so to really get the most out of that sucker, you needed to have a clear understanding of how the architecture worked. And to be fair, they did drastically improve their tools over time, but many would agree that it was not exactly enough to hit the ground running. This is completely contrary to what, of course, the PS4 is. And so Sony realised that quite late in the PS3's development cycle. If you look at it, it wasn't like they realised it in the first 2 to 3 years. And indeed, the indie channel is a fairly recent development. However, it's going to stand them in good stead over time. I'm really hoping that Microsoft take a leaf out of their book and say, you know what, we're going to do that. Now, I am happy that the fact that indies will get full resources, but people are still a little bit apprehensive exactly how Microsoft are going to be dealing with this whole situation. I'm going to read you guys a quote from Lewis Ward, who is a research manager at IDC. And he has said, and I quote, "Xbox Live has emerged as the best overall connected console environment in North America. Just look at the incredible success of Minecraft on the Xbox 360. Imagine what Microsoft could do for indies if it stopped shooting itself in the foot with onerous terms and conditions." Well, this is a big step in that direction. This was the last big philosophical difference between where the Xbox One appeared to be going and where the PS4 and Wii U were going in terms of indies. It's too bad that Microsoft had to be dragged kicking and screaming into doing things right and smart. But hey, however you get there, end quote. In my personal opinion, it is better to give indies as much of a helping hand as possible because, sure, the slice of the pie that you might get in terms of the amount of money is going to be smaller, but the thing is, you never know just how big of a game hit is going to be. You don't know if you're going to have a Minecraft on your hands, and even if not, it's good for your customers. It's good for public relations, it's good for developer relations, it's good for everything involved. And you don't want to be the company that is a nightmare to work with. So I think a good helping hand out there for smaller developers, for indie developers, for developers who are emerging. I think all of this stuff builds a good, solid base to work from. And as I said, Microsoft they weren't that popular to work with. Even from some AAA studios were complaining about them. And that's just not really good in my personal opinion. So I am happy that they are starting to change their tune. I do wish that they would change just a few other bits and pieces here and there. However, they're definitely starting to make steps into the right direction. Despite, as our friend Lewis Ward mentioned, they had to be kicking and screaming to be brought into it. But regardless, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I will see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.